point here that Arnold was the first critic perhaps in British literature who gave the practical definition of poetry. Nobody else ever gave. Earlier poets were thinking, critics were thinking poets are the preachers, poets are the teachers of the mankind, poets are the unacknowledged legislators according to Shelley. Okay, and poets are these, poets are those, but no. Arnold said what others could not express. What others' thoughts were narrow, but Arnold articulated a different kind of a theory of the poetry that was never given, ever given in history. And do you know what was his theory of the poetry? His theory of the poetry was, let me tell you that his theory of the poetry was criticism of life. Poetry is the... Nobody has said this before. Arnold. And if poetry is criticism of life, it means whatever was happening during Victorian age, poets should portray, preach, write down. Because poetry is the criticism of life. Now let's learn his theory of the poetry. Arnold, appreciated especially Milton, Dante, Homer, Virgil, Sophocles, Shakespeare. He was a great admirer of these poets. Look at Homer, Sophocles. Virgil was a Latin poet. Arnold never thinks that Chaucer was a great poet. And Arnold also believes that 18th century was a century of prose, not poetry. It was he who gave the title to 18th century, that 18th century is the age of prose, not poetry. However, we learn in literature that 18th century was a classical age of great poets. Samuel Johnson was there, earlier John Dryden was there in early 18th century. Then there was also Elizabeth Pope, but Arnold in the Victorian age later on altogether rejected that 18th century's influence on him by saying that 18th century was the age of prose rather than poetry. Do you know why? Because according to him, poetry is the criticism of life. And those people were producing the poetry of rich class and ignoring the common masses. How then it is a criticism of life? If you compose poetry on a selected rich class people and ignore the marginalized class people, then how that poetry can be a great poetry?